It begins with a scream that does not belong to any living throat. Tourists who visit the Alamo by day often describe a strange unease, as though they are not alone. But it is at night, when the last footsteps fade from the stone courtyard, that the fortress awakens. Guards have sworn they've seen a figure pacing the roofline, a ghostly soldier clutching a musket, his face pale with fury, vanishing the moment he is challenged. Others tell of the terrible sound of cannon fire echoing across the plaza, though no cannons remain, and the only battlefield here is buried beneath centuries of dust. Some even claim to have seen spectral defenders standing watch in the shadows, as if the siege never ended. But why do the dead linger here, centuries after the bloodshed ended? Is it memory? Justice? Or does the Alamo itself demand that the fallen remain, trapped forever in its cursed stones? Before we uncover more, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more chilling history. The story of the Alamo is often told as a tale of valor, of heroism against impossible odds. But beneath the patriotic myths lies a far darker truth. When Mexican forces stormed the fortress in March of 1836, the massacre that followed left nearly 200 defenders dead, their bodies stripped, burned, and scattered. Blood soaked deep into the ground, and the cries of the dying never seemed to fade. Witnesses described the stench of death that lingered for weeks, clinging to the stone like a curse. The city of San Antonio grew around the ruins, but even as time passed, locals swore the Alamo never truly slept. Night watchmen in the 19th century quit their posts, refusing to patrol its walls after hearing disembodied voices chanting in Spanish. Soldiers stationed nearby claimed ghostly shapes would rise from the very earth, spectral warriors reliving their last moments of agony. And it was not just anonymous guards who reported such things. In the 1890s, a sheriff told of a terrifying encounter. While investigating a disturbance at the mission, he saw glowing figures materialize by the chapel doors. They carried torches that lit no fire, their hollow eyes staring straight through him before they simply dissolved into the mist. The sheriff left shaken, and many wondered, was the Alamo still defended by its fallen? As decades rolled on, tales of hauntings only grew. Children playing in the plaza would hear phantom drums, as if soldiers marched once more into the storm of battle. Locals spoke of seeing a woman in white drifting silently across the courtyard. Some believed she was the ghost of a mother who lost her son in the fighting, forever searching for him among the dead. Others thought she was something older, a spirit tied not to the battle, but to the land itself. Yet perhaps the most unnerving legend is that of the headless guard. Multiple witnesses across the years claimed to have seen a soldier in uniform standing rigid at the chapel entrance. His body is whole, but where his head should be, there is only darkness. He never speaks, never moves. He only waits, as though guarding the dead within. Why does this battlefield, long abandoned, still echo with the agony of its fallen defenders? Why do their shades appear with such fury, as though the siege has never ended? Could it be that the Alamo, built on sacrifice, has become a prison for the souls who fell here? The answers lie not just in ghost stories, but in the blood-soaked history of this fortress, and the legends of what became of the dead after the siege. The dawn that followed March 6, 1836, revealed a nightmare. Smoke still hung heavy over the mission. The cries of the wounded had fallen silent. The Alamo was a charnel house, its courtyards thick with corpses. Some sprawled across the stone, others piled against walls where they made their final stand. Mexican soldiers stripped the dead of weapons and clothing before dragging the bodies outside. What could not be salvaged was set ablaze in great pyres that filled the Texas sky with choking black smoke. Eyewitnesses spoke of the flames consuming not only flesh but the very memory of the fallen, leaving behind only bones and ash. For the people of San Antonio, it was a desecration that seared itself into local memory. They whispered that such treatment of the dead was an offense that would not go unanswered, not in this world, and not in the next. The survivors who buried what remained of the defenders claimed they could hear strange sounds in the air, whispers carried on the wind, groans that rose from the ground itself. The bodies had not been laid to rest with dignity, and so it was said their spirits could not rest either. In the years that followed, the ruins became a place of unease. Travelers passing the chapel at night described seeing ghostly fires flickering where the pyres once burned. Some swore they could see figures writhing in those phantom flames, as though the massacre replayed itself over and over. Others avoided the place entirely, fearing that to step too close to the scorched earth was to invite the curse of the Alamo upon themselves. By the mid-1800s, San Antonio grew rapidly, but the Alamo remained at its heart, and with it, its hauntings. Local accounts tell of residents waking in the night to hear the steady beat of war drums outside their homes, though no soldiers stood there. Families claimed to see shadowy forms drifting through their gardens, the outline of men carrying muskets and banners that belonged to a war long over. In 1871, during a reconstruction project, workers attempted to alter the Alamo's chapel. As they began dismantling part of the structure, something inexplicable occurred. Onlookers claimed that a group of spectral figures appeared on the roof, glowing faintly against the night sky. Each held a sword or musket, their eyes burning with fury. Terrified, the workers abandoned the project. Local law insists that this was no coincidence, that the spirits of the Alamo had risen to defend their sacred ground. The most unsettling stories, however, come from the guardians and night watchmen. In the 19th century, the city hired men to patrol the fortress after dark, but many of them quit after only a few nights. One described hearing heavy footsteps pacing behind him in the chapel, though he was entirely alone. Another claimed to have seen a man in buckskin standing near the altar, staring at him silently before vanishing into thin air. Several insisted they would hear voices whispering in both English and Spanish, some praying, others cursing, all echoing from the walls themselves. One tale that spread widely in the late 1800s was that of the ghostly sentries. People walking near the mission after sunset would see pale figures standing rigid at the corners of the compound, muskets in hand, motionless but watchful. If approached, the guards would dissolve into mist. It was said these were the eternal watchmen, doomed to protect the Alamo even after death, their vigil unending. But perhaps the most infamous legend concerns the land itself. For centuries, the soil of the Alamo has been regarded as cursed. Locals believe that the ground still carries the blood of the slain, and that anyone who disturbs it risks awakening the restless dead. Accounts persist of people who tried to take stones, bricks, or even dirt from the site as souvenirs. Almost without exception, those objects were returned days later, accompanied by reports of misfortune, illness, accidents, nightmares that would not end. Some swore they saw a phantom soldier standing at their bedside, demanding the relic be returned. To this day, the Alamo is treated not just as a shrine of history, but as a place where the veil between the living and the dead remains perilously thin. Its very walls seem to breathe with the memory of battle, and its shadows whisper of those who refuse to be forgotten. Yet the legends grow darker still. Beyond spectral soldiers and phantom fires, some stories speak of something far older, a presence that predates the famous siege, one bound not to the men who fought here, but to the earth beneath the mission itself. And if those accounts are true, then the ghosts of the Alamo are not merely fallen defenders. They may be guardians against something much more sinister. Long before the Battle of 1836, before the walls of the Alamo echoed with musket fire and the clash of bayonets, this land was already steeped in blood. The Spanish first established the mission of San Antonio de Valero in 1718, part of their effort to colonize and convert the region. But the ground on which they built was no empty wilderness. For centuries, it had been home to the indigenous peoples of Texas, tribes who considered the river valley both sacred and dangerous. These tribes warned of spirits that wandered the plains and forests, beings they described as shadows that could whisper, confuse, and even lead travelers to their deaths. Some believed that beneath the fertile earth of San Antonio, older forces slept, spirits tied to the bones of ancestors, jealous and protective of the land. When the Spanish priests laid their foundations, they ignored these warnings. They dug into the soil, planted their cross, and built their mission. And from the beginning, the Alamo was marked by unease. Early accounts from missionaries tell of strange disturbances. Statues of saints would be found toppled in the night. Candles would blow out despite still air. Converts whispered that ghostly figures drifted near the riverbank at dusk, human in shape, yet hollow-eyed, their skin like pale smoke. These sightings were often dismissed as superstition, but as the decades passed, even hardened soldiers stationed at the mission began to report unexplainable events. By the late 1700s, the Alamo had taken on a new role as a military outpost. Soldiers patrolling its walls spoke of hearing cries at night, cries not in Spanish, but in the guttural tones of tribal languages long silenced. Some claimed to see phantom fires burning in the fields beyond the mission, only to vanish when approached. Others swore that while standing guard, they would feel hands pressing against their shoulders, unseen, but heavy enough to make them stagger. The uneasy reputation of the Alamo grew. It became a place of prayer, but also of dread. When illness struck the mission, as it often did in waves of smallpox or fever, some insisted the land itself was cursed. Even in life, the Alamo was a place of restless spirits. And when the bloody Battle of 1836 erupted, many believed that ancient curse was awakened anew, fed by the slaughter of hundreds in a single day. After the battle, stories of hauntings grew darker. Locals said they would hear the sound of weeping near the old well within the compound. Some believed it was the lament of the women and children who had sheltered there during the siege. But others insisted it was older, the voice of an ancient spirit bound to water, a guardian who mourned not just the Alamo, but all who had been forgotten in the centuries before. By the early 20th century, ghost hunters and writers began to collect the stories in earnest. They noted that the hauntings of the Alamo were unlike ordinary ghost tales. These were not just apparitions of the dead reliving their final moments. They carried a weight, a density, as though the ground itself was exhaling sorrow. Some paranormal investigators even suggested that the Alamo was a thin place, a location where the boundary between the living and the dead is fragile, worn down by centuries of suffering. One particularly chilling story dates to the 1930s, when a caretaker making his nightly rounds claimed to have seen something at the chapel doors. At first, it looked like a soldier standing guard, but as he drew closer, the figure grew taller, impossibly tall, towering above him, its head nearly brushing the archway. Its face was indistinct, shifting between features, as though it were many people at once. The caretaker fled, convinced that what he had seen was not a single ghost, but a mass of spirits fused together, a spectral echo of all who had died upon the land. Even in modern times, reports persist. Tourists often describe sudden cold spots in the chapel, even during the sweltering Texas summer. Some say they feel as though they are being watched, an oppressive presence pressing in from the walls themselves. A few have collapsed without warning, overcome by dizziness or nausea, only to recover the moment they are led outside the compound. But what is most unsettling is the frequency with which people describe being touched. Visitors have reported the sensation of hands gripping their arms, tugging at their clothing, or brushing against their hair. Some insist they have heard whispers in their ears, voices that speak in English, Spanish, or tongues they cannot recognize. For many, these encounters are fleeting, easily dismissed. But for others, they leave a lasting impression, a sense that they have stepped too close to something that does not wish to be disturbed. If the Alamo is haunted by the restless spirits of fallen defenders and soldiers, then perhaps those hauntings are expected. Yet the stories of ancient shadows, towering figures and voices older than memory suggest something else. That the Alamo was haunted long before the battle, and that the massacre only deepened a curse already centuries old. As night falls over San Antonio, and the mission lies silent, the question lingers. Are these phantoms truly the ghosts of the Alamo's dead? Or are they something far more ancient, drawn to bloodshed like moths to flame? The answer may lie in the final and most terrifying legends of all, the tales of those who confronted the spirits directly and lived to tell the tale. The Alamo is not merely a relic of war. It is a place where the living and the dead share uneasy ground, and where the echoes of one of history's bloodiest sieges continue to ripple into the present day. In the decades since the massacre, countless witnesses have come forward with tales of ghostly encounters. Some are fleeting glimpses, but others are deeply personal. Confrontations so terrifying they altered the lives of those who experienced them. One of the most famous stories comes from 1911, when a police officer was called to investigate strange noises near the Alamo at night. Expecting nothing more than vagrants, he entered the courtyard with his lantern held high. But instead of trespassers, he found himself surrounded by a group of soldiers. Their uniforms were tattered, their bodies bloodied, their faces pale as bone. He raised his weapon, but they made no move toward him. Instead, they lifted their muskets and gave a silent salute, their eyes hollow and unblinking. Before his lantern could flicker out, they vanished into the night air. The officer, shaken to his core, never forgot the sound that followed. A faint drumbeat, as if from another century, fading into silence. Caretakers have perhaps the most harrowing accounts. In the 1960s, one night watchman patrolling the chapel swore he heard the sound of men arguing inside. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and found the interior bathed in a strange glow. There, he claimed, stood several men in buckskin and ragged military coats, their forms half-transparent. They argued fiercely in English and Spanish, voices raised in anger. Then, one by one, they turned toward him, their faces twisted in fury, before vanishing as the glow extinguished. The watchman quit his position that very night, telling friends that the Alamo is still a battlefield, but the most chilling encounters are not always so grand. They are subtle, intimate. A cold hand brushing a shoulder, a whisper that no one else can hear. Tourists have collapsed upon stepping into the chapel, claiming they felt overwhelmed by sorrow so heavy it was as if dozens of men wept inside them at once. Others describe being followed by shadows through the courtyard, shapes that melt into walls when confronted. And then there is the woman in white. Reported since the mid-19th century, her figure is seen gliding across the plaza, sometimes pausing to kneel as if in prayer. Witnesses describe her face as beautiful but impossibly sad, her eyes downcast, her hands reaching as though searching for someone. Some believe she is the spirit of a widow who lost her husband in the battle, condemned to search forever for his soul. Others suggest she is much older, a remnant of the mission days, perhaps a nun who cared for the dying and whose compassion bound her spirit to the site. Yet perhaps the most disturbing tale of all is the headless sentry. As recently as the 1980s, visitors claimed to see him, a uniformed figure standing guard before the chapel doors, rigid and unyielding. Where his head should be, there is only shadow. He does not move. He does not speak. He only waits, guarding what lies within. Some believe he represents all the defenders who were denied proper burials, stripped of identity and humanity in death, reduced to a nameless sentinel who will never leave his post. Modern paranormal investigators continue to explore the Alamo, armed with cameras, recorders, and devices meant to detect the presence of spirits. They capture strange voices, whispers in Spanish, faint cries of "Remember the Alamo," or prayers in broken English. Others record cold spots so sharp they seem impossible in Texas heat. Many emerge convinced that the site is one of the most haunted in America, its spirits bound not by choice, but by the sheer violence of their end. And so the Alamo remains, by day, a place of education and reverence, a shrine to sacrifice and history. But by night, it is something else entirely, a fortress of phantoms, where soldiers still march, widows still weep, and headless guards still stand watch in the shadows. The legend of the Alamo is more than just a story of Texas independence. It is a story of restless souls, of a battlefield that refuses to forget, of a ground so steeped in suffering that it may never know peace. Visitors come seeking history, but many leave with something more, a chill on their spine, a voice in their ear, or the certainty that they were not alone within those ancient walls. And perhaps that is the greatest curse of the Alamo. Not that its defenders died in vain, but that in death they never truly left. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the silent courtyard of the Alamo under the Texas moon. The stone walls cast long shadows, the air grows colder, and somewhere in the distance, faint but undeniable, comes the echo of a drum, beating still after nearly 2 centuries,